It was 3 in the morning, and I was driving around with some friends. We were lost in a maze of a neighborhood and had been driving around for some time. As we were trying to figure out how to get out of there, we noticed a guy standing on the side of the road with his dog. It was a strange sight to see someone out so late, but we didn't think much of it and continued on our way. The next time we passed by the spot where he usually stood, he was gone. In his place was a massive tree branch pulled into the middle of the road. We barely managed to swerve around it, but luckily we didn't have to get out of the car to move it or anything. And then we saw him again. The same guy. He was crouching in the corner behind a garbage can, just a few feet ahead of the tree branch. It was a chilling sight, and we got pretty freaked out after it. What was he doing there? Was he waiting for us? We questioned ourselves if he had thrown that branch in the street to try and make us get out of the car, but what could he possibly want with that? We were all in panic, trying to find a way out of the neighborhood without having to pass by that street again. We drove around for a few more minutes, trying to find a way out of the neighborhood. Finally, we managed to find a way out, and we breathed a sigh of relief as we left the strange man and his dog behind. We wondered what could have happened if we had left the car to move the tree branch out of the way. What could that guy have done to us? Luckily, we'll never find out. I was driving alone through southern Georgia on a small highway around 2001. It was late at night, and it was darker than usual, and that day I could not see the moon. I was driving a new Lexus that I had just bought in South Florida. Suddenly, a truckload of cars came rushing up behind me, their headlights blinding me as they came closer and closer. They went into the left lane as if they would pass, but I had a bad feeling about them. They all had beers on their hands, and one of the cars had a gigantic Confederate flag waving in the wind, and then the shotguns. There were half a dozen of them, and they started waving them in my direction. I was panicking. I was in the middle of nowhere, and I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my cell phone and tried to dial 911, but there were no bars. It was the early 2000s, and coverage was still spotty in some areas. I showed them the phone anyway, hoping it would deter them from doing anything crazy, but it seemed to have the opposite effect. They started screaming and shouting, clearly agitated by my attempt to call for help. I knew I was in trouble, but I didn't know what to do. They raced ahead into the darkness, leaving me behind. I thought the worst was over. As I continued down the small highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw nothing but the dark road, but I was scared that they would show up again at any time. I finally made it off that small highway and onto an interstate. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened. What did they want? I could have been killed, or worse. It was the scariest moment of my life, and it happened not long after I finished training and upgraded to my own truck. I was driving OTR, headed to Florida from California, somewhere in central New Mexico. It was about 3 a.m., and I had been driving for hours. I had only a little over an hour left on my clock, and was about 50 miles from the nearest truck stop. I was just cruising along, listening to some Journey and trying to stay awake. Then, out of nowhere, a car pulled up beside me, driving very erratically. I could see the driver's face, and it looked like they were in panic. I tried to keep my distance, but they kept swerving into my lane. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and was still a bit distant from the next town. It was just me and this crazy driver on the road, and I didn't know what to do. I took a sip of coffee and looked back, but the car was gone. It had disappeared into thin air in a matter of seconds. I couldn't believe it. Was I hallucinating? Was I too tired? I immediately pulled over and hopped out of the truck, looking up and down the interstate, but there was no car on the road. I've been telling myself I was so exhausted that I must have imagined the whole thing. It's the only theory that makes any sense. I was scared, but I didn't want to risk driving when I was that tired. I said F it and decided to sleep on the side of the road. I now respect my limits and refuse to drive when I'm that exhausted. I was driving at around 3 a.m. I work in concert management and sometimes we talk to the artists and bands and stuff, so it can be late. I never take drugs at all, and I also don't drink when I have to drive, so I was absolutely sober when this happened. There's a long, straight road back to my apartment. No crossings, no intersections, just a simple little path. It's simply a road with fields on either sides. And all of a sudden, the road has a curve. Not a small one that I might have forgotten about. It was a whole effing turn. I was confused, but didn't think too much about it. That is, until I saw the signs on the road, which led me back to the concert I was just coming from. Now, I do not believe in any kind of supernatural stuff and things of the sort. I didn't at the time, and I still don't. However, this was weird, and I thought maybe I am so tired. I turned around on that road and accidentally drove back. So I turned again to finally head home, but the turn was still there. It was simply an effing curve on that road that led back to where I was coming from. I got out of the car, which is a stupid thing to do, I know, but I was tired and happily nothing happened. To look at the whole thing from another point. I walked along turning the road, and when it got straight again, my car stood in front of me. That's when I panicked, turned around, drove back to the concert hall and slept there. When I drove home again the next morning, the road was straight as always. I will never forget that night, and I will never understand it. Scariest thing that's ever happened to me. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to take a drive around my small city at around 3 to 4 a.m. As I drove, I realized that I hadn't seen another car in a while, when suddenly, a pair of headlights appeared around the corner. We were about 500 feet apart when the headlights disappeared, and then I saw taillights and headlights again. Curious, I drove closer and soon found an early 2000s Cadillac on its side in a ditch with books and papers scattered all over the ditch and roadway. It was all sort of banged up, and it took me less than 20 seconds to reach the accident site. But when I got there was no one around. The car was empty. I called the police, and they came to take my statement. About 20 minutes later, some folks arrived and quietly got the attention of the officer that I was talking to. They had the driver with them, and they were friends of his that lived nearby. But here's where things got interesting. The driver was wasted and yelling about how he was going to kill himself. He had been ejected from the car when he flipped and managed to run into the woods, all in the 20 seconds it took me to reach the accident site. He had run to his friend's house and begged them to hide him. They convinced him they were going to take him out of state so he could run away. But from what I could gather, they were very upset that he had shown up at their house at all. It seemed that this wasn't the first time he had done some crazy and stupid things while drinking. I never got the driver's name, and I was never contacted afterward, but I can't help but wonder what happened to him. It was clear that he was in a bad place and had an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. The incident happened 15 years ago, and I hope he got the help he needed.